Is this some kind of joke, or did you really think you could walk in here unnoticed? The captain's voice cut clean through the dry afternoon air, sharp enough to turn heads across the checkpoint as two military police officers tightened their grip on the old man's arms, not violently, just firm enough to make a point, the kind of grip reserved for someone who didn't belong. The gravel beneath their boots crunched in uneven rhythm, a small, restless sound against the otherwise rigid order of the base. And yet the man they held didn't resist, didn't even shift his weight. He simply stood there in a faded brown jacket that had seen more years than most of the soldiers present, his posture relaxed but unmoving, like a post driven deep into the ground long before any of them had arrived, his pale blue eyes scanning the horizon beyond the gates rather than the officer in front of him, as if the confrontation was something distant, something already settled in his mind. Captain Daniel Brooks stepped closer, the sun catching the crisp edges of his uniform, everything about him precise, controlled, earned through training and rank, yet his expression carried that unmistakable edge of impatience, the quiet irritation of a man used to being obeyed without question. "You're on a restricted installation, sir," he said, emphasizing the last word just enough to strip it of respect, "and right now, you're creating a problem." One of the MPs shifted slightly, adjusting his hold as if expecting resistance that never came, the old man's hands hanging loosely at his sides, weathered, steady, unmoved by the tension tightening around him. "Name," Brooks demanded, his tone no longer a question but a test, something to be passed or failed in the span of a single breath. The old man's gaze finally drifted toward him, slow and deliberate, not defiant, not submissive, just present, and when he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, carrying the quiet weight of someone who had long since stopped raising it to be heard. "Arthur Hayes," he said, "nothing more, no explanation, no defense, just the name." And for a brief second, the wind seemed to shift across the open tarmac, tugging lightly at the loose edge of his jacket, as if the world itself paused to listen, but Captain Brooks only exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "Arthur Hayes," he repeated, glancing toward the MPs with a faint shake of his head, "doesn't mean anything without clearance." He stepped closer, closing the distance in a calculated move meant to assert control. "So here's how this is going to go," he continued, his voice dropping just enough to harden the edges. "You're going to tell me who authorized you to be here, or you're going to be escorted off this base in cuffs." The word hung there, deliberate, heavy, and one of the MPs reached instinctively toward his belt, not yet acting, just preparing, waiting for the signal. Arthur Hayes didn't react, didn't flinch, his eyes never leaving the captain's, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the entire scene seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of engines, the faint clatter of equipment, all fading into the background as something unspoken settled between them, something the younger men couldn't quite name but could feel pressing against the edges of the moment. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his stance, the old man spoke again, calm and certain. "You might want to call Admiral Reeves," he said, as if it were the most ordinary suggestion in the world. And somewhere behind the captain, one of the soldiers shifted, just slightly, as though a line had been crossed that none of them fully understood yet. Captain Brooks did not respond immediately, but the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed the shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the air itself had grown heavier around the name that had just been spoken. He glanced briefly toward the MPs, then back at Arthur Hayes, studying him more carefully now, not with respect, not yet, but with the first trace of uncertainty threading through his otherwise controlled demeanor. "You expect me to believe you can just drop a name like that and walk through a secured gate," he said, though the sharpness in his tone no longer carried the same effortless confidence as before. One of the MPs adjusted his stance again, his grip loosening by a fraction of an inch, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt. And somewhere off to the side, a young lieutenant who had been overseeing a nearby logistics detail paused mid-step, his attention drawn to the exchange, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the old man's posture, the stillness, the way he stood without tension despite the situation pressing in around him. "Admiral Reeves is not expecting visitors," Brooks continued, his voice regaining some of its edge as he reached for control, "especially not unverified civilians." The word landed deliberately, a label meant to reduce, to categorize, to close the matter, but Arthur Hayes did not respond, did not argue, did not defend. He simply remained as he was, his gaze steady, his silence deeper now, as though he had already said everything that mattered. and that silence began to stretch, uncomfortable, pulling at the edges of the moment in a way no raised voice could have accomplished. The lieutenant stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, stopping just short of the group. "Captain," he said carefully, not interrupting, but inserting himself just enough to be noticed. Brooks turned his head slightly, irritation flickering across his face at the intrusion. "What is it, Cole?" he asked. The question clipped, controlled. Lieutenant Eric Cole hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes moving from the captain to the old man and back again. "Sir, maybe we should verify before escalating," he said, choosing each word with precision, aware of the line he was approaching. Brooks let out a short breath, something between a scoff and a warning. "There is nothing to verify," he replied, though his gaze flicked once more toward Arthur Hayes, as if searching for something he could not quite define, something that refused to fit the narrative he was trying to enforce. A gust of wind swept across the tarmac, carrying with it the distant hum of aircraft and the faint metallic rattle of equipment, the sounds of a base in constant motion. Yet here, at this small checkpoint, everything seemed to slow, compress, focus inward on a single unresolved point. Cole shifted his weight, his instincts pulling against protocol. "Sir, with respect," he added, lowering his voice just enough to keep the exchange contained. "That name," he paused, choosing not to finish the sentence out loud, but the implication hung there, quiet and persistent. Brooks stared at him for a moment longer than necessary, measuring, calculating, and then his attention returned to the old man, whose expression had not changed, whose presence remained as immovable as it had been from the start, and for the first time, Captain Brooks felt it, not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable sense that the situation in front of him was no longer as simple as it had seemed, that somewhere beneath the surface of this quiet confrontation, something larger was beginning to move. The silence did not break, it shifted, bending under the weight of something unspoken as Lieutenant Cole took a half step back, already reaching for the small radio clip to his vest, his fingers hovering for just a second as training collided with instinct, because there were rules, clear ones, about who to call and when, and none of them included bypassing the chain of command over an old man with no visible credentials. Yet the feeling would not let go, that quiet certainty that something here did not add up. "Cole," Captain Brooks said sharply, catching the movement, "stand down." The order came clean and direct, but it lacked the finality it would have carried minutes ago. Cole paused, his hand still near the radio, his eyes flicking once more toward Arthur Hayes, searching for something he could not explain, and what he found was not fear, not confusion, but patience. The kind of patience that did not come from waiting in line or standing at attention, but from years, from distance, from having seen moments like this play out before. "Sir," Cole said carefully, lowering his voice, "just one verification call." Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders tightening. He was a man who believed in order, in systems that worked because everyone followed them, and this, whatever this was, threatened to slip outside that structure. "You are not authorized to make that call," he replied, though his gaze shifted again, briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the old man, as if expecting him to react, to push, to demand. But Arthur Hayes did none of that. He simply stood there, unmoving, the wind tugging faintly at the edge of his jacket, his eyes calm, distant, as though the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond this checkpoint. The radio in Cole's hand felt heavier now, the second stretching thin, and then, without asking again, without announcing it, he pressed the transmit button, his voice low, controlled. "Command, this is Lieutenant Cole at Gate Charlie, requesting verification on a name." The words were simple, routine on the surface, but beneath them ran a current of urgency he could not fully suppress. There was a brief crackle of static, then a voice answered, standard, procedural, "Go ahead." Cole glanced once at Brooks, knowing the line had been crossed, then spoke the name, clear and steady, "Arthur Hayes." The response did not come immediately, and that delay, small as it was, changed everything, because in a system built on instant data, instant answers, silence meant something. It stretched across the radio like a shadow, and then the voice returned, different now, less certain. "Stand by." The words were followed by another pause, longer this time, and in that pause, the entire atmosphere at the gate shifted. The MPs loosened their grip without realizing it, their hands no longer as firm on the old man's arms. Brooks straightened slightly, his attention locking onto the radio as if it had become the center of gravity for the moment, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle echoed faintly across the base, unnoticed by most, but not by Arthur Hayes, whose gaze lifted just a fraction, not in anticipation, but in recognition, as though he had been expecting that sound all along. The radio did not answer right away, and that silence carried a weight that none of them could ignore. It was not the casual delay of a busy channel or a routine lookup, it was something else, something that stretched thin across the seconds until it began to press against the edges of the moment, and when the voice finally came back, it was no longer the same voice that had responded before. The tone had changed, tightened, sharpened with a sudden alertness that cut through the static. "Lieutenant, confirm that name." Cole did not hesitate. "Arthur Hayes," he repeated, steady, clear, and this time the response was immediate, but not complete, just a short breath, almost inaudible, followed by, "Stand by and do not move him." The words landed with quiet authority, and then the line went dead. Captain Brooks stared at the radio for a fraction longer than necessary before turning his attention back to Cole, his expression hard, controlled, but the certainty that had defined him minutes ago was no longer intact. "Who did you just reach?" he asked, though the question felt secondary now, almost irrelevant compared to what had just shifted. Cole lowered the radio slowly, his grip firm, his voice calm. "Command routing." "Escalated the request," he said, choosing his words carefully, and Brooks exhaled through his nose, a habit born from discipline, from years of maintaining control in situations that demanded it. But this was different. This was not a situation he had trained for, because nothing in his experience accounted for a single name-altering protocol mid-transmission. The MPs, still positioned at Arthur Hayes's sides, had loosened their hold entirely now, their hands hovering rather than gripping. Uncertain, as if the old man might no longer belong to them at all, and Hayes himself had not moved, not even an inch, his posture unchanged, his eyes now lifted slightly toward the distant edge of the base where the faint sound of engines had grown more distinct, a low, steady rumble rolling across the open space like distant thunder. Brooks followed that sound instinctively, his head turning just enough to catch the first glimpse of movement beyond the far security line, a set of vehicles approaching with a precision that was unmistakable, not hurried, not chaotic, but deliberate, controlled, the kind of movement reserved for something important, something that did not need to rush because it commanded the space ahead of it. And as the convoy drew closer, the atmosphere at the gate shifted again, conversations nearby faded, soldiers who had been moving through their routines slowed, their attention drawn without being told, because there was a rhythm to command presence that every service member recognized, even before they saw it clearly. Cole felt it too, that tightening in the air, that sense of something larger stepping into the frame, and he glanced once more at Arthur Hayes, whose expression had not changed, whose calm remained untouched by the escalation unfolding around him, as if this was not a surprise, not a disruption, but a continuation of something already in motion, something that had begun long before this moment at the gate. Captain Brooks straightened his posture, instinct overriding confusion, his uniform settling into its perfect lines as the convoy approached within clear view now, black vehicles moving in coordinated silence, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Brooks felt the ground shift beneath the situation he thought he controlled, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to make one thing clear. Whatever was about to happen next was no longer his decision to make. The convoy rolled to a precise halt 20 yards from the checkpoint, engines idling in a low, controlled hum that seemed to settle over the entire area like a command without words, and for a moment no one moved, not the MPs, not Lieutenant Cole, not even Captain Brooks, whose posture had gone rigid with instinct, every line of his uniform sharp, every movement calculated, because this was no longer a situation of uncertainty, this was presence, authority, something that demanded immediate alignment. The rear door of the lead vehicle opened with deliberate calm, and a uniformed officer stepped out first, scanning the perimeter with a practiced eye before turning slightly, creating space, and then he appeared, Admiral Jonathan Reeves, his presence unmistakable even before his insignia caught the light, his posture straight but unforced, the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself because it had already been earned long before this moment. Conversations across the nearby area died completely, not by order, but by recognition, the subtle, almost instinctive understanding that something significant had just entered the space. Captain Brooks stepped forward immediately, his voice firm, controlled. "Sir," he began, but the Admiral did not look at him, not yet. His gaze had already moved past the captain, past the MPs, settling on the old man standing between them, and in that instant, something shifted again. Something deeper, quieter, the kind of shift that did not need explanation because it could be felt in the way the air seemed to still, in the way even the distant sounds of the bass seemed to fade into the background. Arthur Hayes did not move, did not straighten, did not react in any visible way. He simply met the Admiral's gaze, calm and steady, as if this moment had been waiting for them both, and for a brief second that stretched longer than it should have, Admiral Reeves stood completely still, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him as if searching through layers of time rather than distance. The MPs, sensing something they could not define, released their hold entirely, stepping back without being told, their hands dropping to their sides as though the situation had quietly passed beyond their authority, and Captain Brooks felt it then, fully, the shift he had only begun to sense before, the realization that whatever this was, it was no longer a question of protocol or procedure, but something personal, something that reached beyond rank and into something far older, far deeper. The Admiral took one slow step forward, then another, closing the distance with measured precision, and still he said nothing, the silence stretching again, heavy, deliberate, until it carried more weight than any command could have, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than expected, not loud, not sharp, but steady, grounded. "Arthur," he said, the name spoken not as identification, but as recognition, and in that single word, the entire scene seemed to settle into place, every question, every doubt, every assumption that had filled the last few minutes dissolving without explanation, leaving only the quiet certainty that the man standing at the center of it all had never needed to prove anything at all. The name did not echo, it settled, landing with a quiet finality that no one present could ignore, and for a moment that stretched beyond comfort, Admiral Reeves simply stood there, his gaze locked on Arthur Hayes, not as a superior addressing a civilian, but as a man recognizing something far older than rank, far deeper than protocol. And then, without warning, the Admiral straightened, his shoulders drawing back with precise control, and in one smooth, deliberate motion, he raised his hand in a formal salute, sharp and unwavering, the gesture cutting clean through the stillness like a line drawn in stone. No one spoke, no one moved, because in that instant, the entire hierarchy of the scene inverted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Captain Brooks felt it like a physical shift, the ground beneath his certainty giving way as his mind struggled to reconcile what he was seeing. A four-star admiral standing at attention before a man he had just ordered detained. The MPs froze where they stood, their posture uncertain, caught between instinct and disbelief, while Lieutenant Cole remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the salute, understanding settling into him not as a shock, but as confirmation of what he had already sensed. Arthur Hayes did not return the salute immediately, he did not react with urgency or surprise, he simply looked at the Admiral for a brief second longer, as if measuring something unseen, something carried across years rather than seconds, and then, slowly, with the same quiet control that had defined every movement he had made since arriving at the gate, he lifted his hand and returned the gesture, not with force, not with display, but with precision, the kind that came from repetition, from memory, from a time when such gestures had meant something far more than ceremony. The wind moved lightly across the open space, brushing against uniforms and fabric, carrying with it the faint scent of fuel and sun-warmed metal, but even that seemed distant now, secondary to the silent exchange that had just taken place, because no words had been spoken, and yet everything had been said. Admiral Reeves lowered his hand first, his posture relaxing just enough to shift from formality to something more personal, though the weight of the moment remained. "You should have told them," he said quietly, his voice steady, not accusing, not frustrated, but carrying a note of respect that did not need to be explained. Arthur Hayes gave the smallest shake of his head, almost imperceptible. "They were doing their job," he replied, his voice as calm as ever, and that was all, no elaboration, no defense, just a simple statement that seemed to settle over the scene with more authority than any order could have. Captain Brooks felt the words land harder than any reprimand, not because they were directed at him, but because they were not, because the man he had challenged had not taken offense, had not raised his voice, had not even attempted to assert who he was, and yet here he stood, acknowledged by the highest authority. Present without ever needing to claim it, and in that realization, Brooks understood something he had not been taught in any manual or training, something that could not be issued or earned through rank alone, that respect, real respect, did not come from being recognized, it came from never needing to be. No one moved even after the salute ended, as if the moment had not yet released them, as if something still lingered in the air that demanded to be understood before anyone could return to motion, and it was Captain Brooks who felt it most, standing just a few feet away, the weight of his own actions settling over him in a way that no formal reprimand ever could, because this was not correction, this was contrast, the sharp and undeniable difference between authority claimed and authority carried, and for the first time since he had stepped into command, Brooks found himself without a script, without the familiar structure of orders and responses to guide him. Admiral Reeves shifted slightly, turning just enough to acknowledge the others now, his presence expanding outward again, filling the space with quiet control. "Captain," he said, not harshly, not sharply, but with a tone that carried more weight than volume ever could. Brooks stepped forward immediately, his posture snapping back into place. "Sir," he replied, his voice steady, though something beneath it had changed, something less rigid, less certain. "You handled a situation with the information you had," Reeves continued, his eyes steady on the younger officer, "but there are moments when information is not what defines the situation." The words were measured, deliberate, each one placed with care, and Brooks felt them settle, not as criticism, but as something more enduring, something that would remain long after this moment passed. The Admiral turned back toward Arthur Hayes, his expression softening just slightly. "We have been trying to reach you," he said, and for the first time, there was something almost personal in his voice, something that did not belong to rank or duty. Hayes gave a faint nod. "I figured," he replied, simple, understated, as if the matter required no further explanation, and Reeves allowed the smallest hint of a smile to pass across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Around them, the base had begun to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, soldiers returning to motion, conversations resuming in low tones, but the energy had changed, the earlier tension replaced by something quieter, something reflective, as if everyone present understood they had witnessed something they were not meant to fully grasp, only to remember. Lieutenant Cole stepped back fully now, his role complete. Though his gaze lingered on Hayes for a moment longer, the image of the salute fixed in his mind, a reference point he knew he would carry forward, while the MPs straightened, their earlier uncertainty replaced with a quiet respect that needed no instruction. Captain Brooks remained where he was for a second longer than necessary, his eyes moving from the Admiral to Hayes, and in that brief glance, something shifted within him, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, a recalibration, the beginning of an understanding that would not fully form until much later. And then, with measured control, he took a small step back, creating space, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because for the first time since the old man had arrived at the gate, Brooks was no longer trying to manage the situation, he was simply witnessing it unfold, and in that quiet adjustment, the balance of the moment settled into its final shape, not forced, not declared, but accepted by everyone who stood within it. The moment did not end with the salute, it settled into something quieter, something that lingered in the space between movement and stillness as Admiral Reeves turned slightly, gesturing toward the waiting convoy without urgency. "We should not keep them waiting," he said, his tone measured, but the words carried a different meaning beneath the surface, something that extended beyond schedules or protocol. Arthur Hayes gave a small nod, his gaze drifting briefly across the base, not scanning, not searching, but remembering, as if every detail, the distant hum of engines, the heat rising off the pavement, the faint snap of a flag somewhere beyond the buildings, connected to something far older than the structures now standing around him. As they began to walk, Reeves matched Hayes's pace without hesitation, neither leading nor following, simply moving beside him, and that alone shifted the balance once more. Subtle, but unmistakable. Captain Brooks noticed it immediately, the absence of hierarchy in their movement, the absence of command in the way they carried themselves, and for the first time, he understood that whatever history existed between them did not fit within the lines of rank or position, it existed outside of it, something earned in a different place, under different conditions. The convoy doors remained open, officers standing by, but no one rushed them, no one spoke. The quiet extended outward, creating a path that did not need to be cleared because it was Already understood, Lieutenant Cole stepped aside fully now, his posture straight, his expression composed, though his eyes followed the two men as they moved, committing the image to memory, the kind of moment that would return years later without warning, shaping decisions in ways he would not fully realize until much later. The MPs stood at attention, no longer uncertain, their earlier hesitation replaced with clarity, not because they had been corrected, but because they had witnessed something that redefined the situation entirely. Captain Brooks remained where he was until the last possible second, then stepped back, giving space as Hayes and Reeves passed, and as they did, Hayes paused just briefly, not enough to interrupt the movement, but enough to acknowledge the captain without turning fully, a small inclination of his head, almost imperceptible, yet it carried more weight than any formal exchange. Brooks held that moment, absorbing it, understanding that it was not forgiveness, not approval, but something simpler, something more grounded, recognition, and it settled into him with a quiet permanence. As Hayes continued forward, the sunlight caught the edge of his jacket, revealing for just a second the worn fabric, the subtle fray at the cuff, details that spoke of time rather than status, and Brooks found himself noticing them in a way he had not before, not as signs of age, but as markers of something carried, something lived, something that could not be issued or replaced, the convoy. Doors closed with soft precision once Hayes and Reeves had taken their seats, the engines rising slightly as the vehicles prepared to move, and as they pulled away, the base resumed its rhythm, but not entirely as it had been. Something had shifted, not in structure, not in command, but in understanding, and for those who had stood at that gate, the moment would not fade into routine, it would remain, quiet and steady, like a line drawn not in orders, but in memory, reminding them that some names do not need to be announced, they only need to be recognized. The convoy disappeared beyond the far edge of the base, its presence fading into the distance, but the silence it left behind did not vanish with it, it lingered, settling into the ground beneath their boots, into the air that moved more slowly now, as if the moment had pressed something permanent into the space, and for a while no one spoke, not because they had been ordered not to, but because there was nothing that needed to be said. Captain Brooks remained at the gate longer than necessary. His posture still straight, but no longer rigid, his eyes fixed on the road where the vehicles had vanished, replaying the last few minutes with a clarity that felt sharper than anything he had experienced in training, because this had not been about procedure, it had not been about rules or authority, it had been about something that could not be written down, something that had to be recognized in real time or missed entirely. Lieutenant Cole stepped closer, not intruding, just present. "Sir," he said quietly, and Brooks turned slightly, acknowledging him with a brief nod, the formality still there, but softened, changed in a way that did not need explanation. "You made the right call," Brooks said after a moment, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Cole shook his head slightly. "I just listened," he replied, and that was enough, because both of them understood what that meant, that sometimes the difference between escalation and understanding was not knowledge, but attention. Around them, the base had returned to motion, vehicles moving, voices rising again, the rhythm of duty reasserting itself, but it felt different now, quieter in a way that was not about volume, but about awareness, as if something invisible had shifted just beneath the surface. One of the MPs adjusted his stance, then glanced toward Brooks. "Sir," he began, then stopped, unsure what he was about to ask, and Brooks met his gaze, holding it for a second before giving a small nod, not a command, not an order, just acknowledgement, and the MP straightened, understanding without words that the moment had already passed, that nothing more needed to be done. Brooks looked down briefly at the ground, at the faint impressions left in the gravel where Arthur Hayes had stood, small, almost unnoticeable marks that would be gone by the end of the day, erased by movement, by time, by routine, but the moment itself would not disappear so easily. It had already taken root somewhere deeper, somewhere that would not be worn away by the passing of hours or the repetition of duty. He lifted his gaze again, the horizon stretching out beyond the base, the sky wide and clear, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he allowed himself a slow breath, not to regain control, but to accept that control had never truly been his to begin with, because there are moments that do not belong to rank, moments that do not answer to authority, moments that reveal something older than both, and those who recognize them carry that understanding forward, quietly, without needing to speak it, because respect is Not demanded, it is remembered.